So we're continuing our series on well-known phrases that originate in the Bible. And today's well-known phrase is from 1 Samuel 13, verse 14. And the phrase is this: a man after his own heart. Although looking at the account of Saul in this chapter, another well-known phrase, pride comes before a fall, would be appropriate. You could say pride was one of the things that kept Saul from being a man after God's own heart. C.S. Lewis said that a proud man is always looking down on things and people. And of course, as long as you're looking down, you can't see something that is above you. Pride in terms of self-importance and lack of humility sees no one above you. Pride may say, I apologize, but never says, I'm sorry. Pride avoids remorse through self-justification or excuses, or shifting blame onto others. Pride relies on self and neglects to rely on God. Pride leads to disobedience. Excuses and self-justification, blaming others, self-importance, failing to rely on God, disobedience. This is beginning to read like a charge sheet against Saul, because unfortunately, it's all here as we read about him in 1 Samuel 13. Saul's first act as king, you see in verse 2 of this chapter, is to assemble an army of able soldiers, 2,000 with him at Michmash and 1,000 with Jonathan at Gibeon. We begin to see perhaps some evidence of Saul's pride. Jonathan attacks the Philistine garrison at Geba and defeats them. And the Philistines hear of it, of course, so clearly they respond with force. The Israelite army is in crisis. Perhaps to encourage his troops, Saul has the trumpet blown. People are summoned to join him at Gilgal, and Saul is hailed a hero. It isn't unusual for a king to be given credit for such a victory, but the fact that Saul is satisfied to take credit for Jonathan's victory gives some indication of the pride at work in him. Now, what do Jocelyn Bell Burnell, Nettie Stevens, and Rosalind Franklin have in common? Well, they all made landmark scientific discoveries, pulsars and chromosome and DNA research, respectively, discoveries for which only men received credit. There are many more cases like theirs. It's incredibly frustrating and unjust that someone else's hard work be credited to another person. It's not uncommon, is it, to hear of management taking credit for the ideas of employees. As Christians, we shouldn't feel comfortable at all with receiving credit for someone else's work or achievement, however small. If we're tempted to do so, we need to nip it in the bud, because the pride at the root of the temptation must not be allowed to take hold, which is pretty much what the Life Application Bible article was saying that about the subject that I read on Friday. So all credit to them. In fact, I'd be a hypocrite, wouldn't I, if I didn't give credit to sources that I've used, like the Life Application Bible, Joyce Baldwin's commentary, for example, for ideas and background information used in this message. How many times have we been guilty of not speaking up and refusing credit for something that was actually due to someone else? Credit was due to them. Let's not allow pride to take a strong hold in our lives. A lesson we can learn from poor Saul in 1 Samuel 13. And that's not all we can learn from Saul and the decisions that he makes in this chapter. So let's explore a little further. The Philistines assembled to fight in Israel, a scene reminiscent of an epic, big-budget Hollywood movie. Formidable is not the word. The number of soldiers were depicted as being as numerous as the sand in the seashore, verse 5. Understandably, Israel's soldiers were afraid, which again is not the word. Some hid in caves and thickets, among the rocks and in pits and cisterns. Some of the wider hirelings hightailed it across the Jordan to Gad and to Gilead. Saul is under pressure, my third understatement. The situation is testing him to the limit. And it is a test. It's a test of his patience and his obedience. In 1 Samuel 10, verse 8, Samuel had told Saul, "Go down ahead of me to Gilgal. I will surely come down to you to sacrifice burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, but you must wait 7 days until I come to you and tell you what you are to do." Now, this might have been a principle Saul was expected to follow in all such times of trouble. Wait 7 days for Samuel's arrival, and when he arrives, he'll tell him what to do. But here's Saul and his men are deserting, and the pressure increases. He must do something. The 7 days are up. No sign of Samuel. So what does Saul do? Saul offers up the burnt offering himself. And just as he's finished doing that, lo and behold, Samuel arrives. And Saul just walks up to him casually and greets him as if nothing's wrong. No sign of remorse. "What have you done?" asks Samuel. And here come Saul's excuses. Verse 11, he says, "The men were scattering." And now here comes the transfer of blame. "And when you didn't come at the set time." And then more excuses. "And the Philistines were assembling at Michmash." He then seems to appear virtuous. Verse 12, "I have not sought the Lord's favour, so I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering." Two things here. Firstly, if he had gone before the Lord, prayerfully seeking him and seeking his favour, rather than disobediently making the burnt offering, he probably would have gained the answer he was looking for. Secondly, his actions show that he places more importance in a religious ritual than faith and trust in God. Saul perhaps thought that the ritual might impress and encourage the troops, maybe. "You've done a foolish thing," says Samuel in verse 13. Foolish in the biblical context means not only lacking intelligence, but also being spiritually and morally wrong. Samuel tells him that he's not kept the command God gave him, and his punishment's severe. His kingdom will not endure. And this takes us to our verse featuring our well-known phrase, verse 14 of 1 Samuel 13. It says, "The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people, because you have not kept the Lord's command." Samuel wasn't just a wise advisor. He was God's prophet. God spoke through him, and he expressed God's command to Saul. By taking matters into his own hands, Saul had rebelled against God's will. Rebelling against God. Saul didn't realize that although, yes, Saul had been anointed king, Israel was still God's chosen people. And above Saul, God was king over the nation and required Saul's obedience. So God had already chosen a successor, whom we know, of course, to be David. King David will always get it right, of course, we know that too. But nevertheless, he was a man after God's own heart. God looks at the heart, 1 Samuel 16, verse 7. So verse 15 shows Samuel depart from Saul, heading for Gibeah, leaving Saul and his 600 men left with him. A sad story, really, and a stark warning about the danger of pride and self-reliance. And all of us are susceptible to it. We soon realize how self-important we are when something or someone disregards us in some way. James 4:6 says, "God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble." Humility recognizes that our value to God does not change and allows us to value others more. As Rick Warren puts it, true humility is not thinking less of yourself, it is thinking of yourself less. Humility places us in the right attitude of heart to listen to and rely on God. And when put to the test, reliance on ourselves can lead to anxiety, rash judgment, and we can quickly become overwhelmed and defeated. Testing times call for us to wait on the Lord, to run first to him, to put our trust in his word and his promises, to trust in his timing and not allow impatience to lead us into taking matters into our own hands. And when we are tested, it helps to remember the things God has done for us in the past, how he has come through and proved himself faithful. Know that your faith and trust in God is never misplaced. Saul and his army would have done well to remember this, and perhaps then Saul might not have strayed from obedience. 1 Samuel 11 tells us of the victory against the Ammonites when Saul declared, "This day the Lord has rescued Israel." That's verse 13 of chapter 11. Saul could have trusted the same faithful God, knowing he would have delivered them again, and so waited that bit longer for Samuel to arrive. There's so much that we can learn from Saul's conflict with the Philistines in this chapter. One more thing that comes to mind is not being swayed by the pressure of pleasing others or being swayed by the behavior of others to depart from God's will. I'm drawing that loosely from the pressure Saul was under due to his dwindling army and perhaps his decision to make the burnt offering. So to conclude, God is sovereign, all-powerful, all-sufficient, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all, Ephesians 4:6, who crowns us with love and compassion, Psalm 103 verse 4. However things seem, however we're tested in life, God is sovereign. And when we go to him in submission, in obedience, in faith, he blesses and restores us. We do well to follow Micah's sound counsel. Micah 6 verse 8. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Amen.